Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Perhaps the next story about betrayal will be from your city. And we start. My legs were shaking from fatigue and unusual excitement as I stepped out of the taxi on a quiet street in San Jose. Usually, I arrived late in the evening, and then Emily would greet me with an apologetic smile, like, "Sorry, I couldn't pick you up at the airport, the kids were naughty," or "I was late at the office." But this time, I arrived earlier intentionally and without warning. I wanted to make a surprise, buy a bouquet of her favorite lilies on the way, and just show up on the doorstep, outside of schedule, outside of all the usual rituals. Emily and I got married 10 years ago when I was just starting my journey in the IT field. I quickly rose through the ranks, collected professional certifications, moved from one corporation to another, and eventually rose to the position of Director of Operations at a startup located in the heart of Silicon Valley. The work was exhausting. Constant negotiations, business tours, tons of documents, and endless meetings. However, the comfort of home and the sight of the wife's shining eyes should, in theory, compensate for these loads. At least, that's how I imagined it for many years. Family life, as they say, is a complicated thing. It doesn't always look like a happy picture from a Christmas card. Of course, we tried to support each other, trying not to lose the spark. But gradually our conversations boiled down to routine. What to eat for dinner? What time should we take the children to school? We have two sons, 9 and 6 years old. What bills to pay? I sometimes went on business trips for almost a week, or even 2. I came back and felt as if there was a lot of noise around, but there was emptiness inside me. I often thought, so what? Everyone lives like this. Work, money, family. This is adult life. Who has it easy now? But today, everything went differently. For the first time in a long time, I heard something like a quiet foreboding, as if an alarm was ringing within me. Come home, my inner voice seemed to tell me, there is something you don't know. On the way from the airport, I stopped at a small flower shop on the outskirts of San Jose and talked with a smiling salesman named Sam. He said cheerfully, "Lilies for your beloved? Dude, you're just a hero. Rarely does anyone take lilies from us. Usually everyone runs for roses. But if she loves lilies, this is a great choice." I smiled, paid, transferred the bouquet to my left hand, and left with some hope in my chest. I called a taxi and tried to imagine how I would sneak up to the door, enter quietly, maybe have time to put some flowers in the kitchen, and then hug Emily from behind and say something like, "I'm home, honey." The pleasant picture warmed my heart. After all, sometimes just a few sincere moments can give impetus to new feelings. The taxi stopped at our house in Willow Glen. It's beautiful and calm here. Traditional houses, neat lawns, trees along the street. I walked up the path to the front door and realized that something was wrong inside. It was too quiet. Emily usually listens to music or watches TV series if she has a free minute. However, the children were with their grandmother in Los Angeles for the weekend, so she could have just dozed off. I opened the door with my keys and went into the hallway. He closed the door carefully, trying not to make any noise. I took off my jacket, hung it on a hanger, put my shoes on the shelf, and straightened my tie, which was already quite choking me. I was still holding the bouquet in my hands. It suddenly dawned on me. There really wasn't any music playing, but from afar, from the top floor, some muffled sounds could be heard, sharp, intermittent, as if someone was moaning. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. I swallowed automatically, feeling the bitterness in my mouth. At first, the thought crept into her head that maybe she was watching a movie, some kind of thriller. But the moaning was clearly not cinematic. I slowly, almost silently, walked up the stairs. Every step felt like a pulse in my temples. The bedroom was at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly open, and as soon as I approached, I heard Emily's familiar voice. "Oh my God, Dave, you're so big. God, keep going. I, I." She spoke almost in a whisper, but in her intonations there was precisely that passion that I had not heard for many years. She moaned, exhaled in short breaths, and then exhaled with a burst of breath. My husband can't even come close. Oh, so good. I froze in place as if my heart had turned to stone. Everything turned upside down inside. I didn't even immediately realize that the bouquet began to slip out of my palm and my fingers were going numb. But I didn't scream or rush inside, as if the instinct of self-preservation decided to turn on the freeze mode. I took another slow step and saw a picture I never wanted to see. At the foot of the bed stood a tall, broad-shouldered man, completely naked from the back, and in front of him, on the bed itself, Emily was reclining. My Emily, the one to whom I gave all my youth, confidence in the future, my devotion. And now she was wearing one of my blue shirts, unbuttoned almost completely, and this strange hand was stroking her hips, her legs. An absurd question immediately popped into my head. Why in my shirt? Are there really no other things? Then I heard her laugh quietly, and the man, whose face I did not see, said in a rough but pleased voice, "Baby, you're driving me crazy." She arched over, pulled off the remains of her shirt, and immediately even more frank moans began to sound, this time without any embarrassment. She apparently didn't care. She felt completely safe, believing that her husband was away. I stood at the door, rooted to the spot. No anger, no jealousy, just a terrible emptiness, and a slowly growing awareness that everything that I considered my home, my rear, had collapsed. The world cracked, and through this crack, I saw the reality that had existed, perhaps, for more than a month. I was shocked not so much by the sight of their closeness as by my own reaction, complete numbness. Silently, I stepped back. "What's next?" flashed through my head. In theory, the normal reaction is to enter, make a scandal, shout, kick them out, punch your lover in the face. But I didn't feel the strength in myself, because already at the moment when I saw them, something died inside me. After a few seconds that dragged on forever, I quietly, very smoothly closed the door. I don't know if they heard the doorknob click. Maybe not. Maybe they were too into each other. I turned to the mirror in the corridor. The look was empty, like that of a person who had lost the meaning of existence. Somewhere below, inside me, a wild pain began to awaken such that as soon as I took a deep breath, I immediately felt how everything was compressing. However, I knew that if I gave vent to my emotions now, I would not be able to control myself. As if in a trance, I looked at my hand and noticed an engagement ring, the same one that we bought in a cozy store in San Francisco when we were getting ready for our wedding. Emily then said, "Mark, take the simplest thing, the main thing that symbolizes the two of us." That day we laughed, held hands, and made plans for the future. What irony, symbolizes the two of us, and now this ring has become a symbol of naive promises that will never be fulfilled. I slowly turned the ring, feeling the metal rubbing against my skin. Then I started taking it off, as if it was going to burn me. He pulled the ring off, and it easily slipped off his finger. It's interesting how simple it is. One move, and you're already defenseless against the collapsing truth. At this moment, I noticed that the lilies in my hands began to fade. Of course, it was just my imagination, but it seemed that the petals were already falling and losing their shape. A dull but bright pain stabbed in my chest, and I felt that if I stayed here, at this door, even for a second, I would either throw myself inside or start bawling like a child. I just needed to leave. Move. Don't stand. Scroll through 1,000 thoughts in my mind before I decide what to do next. But instead, I did something strange. Quietly, trying not to stomp, I went down the stairs. I was only interested in one thing, getting to the sofa. For some reason, I needed this point of reference, a place where I could understand my life from now on. A minute later, I was sitting on our soft cafe all-late leather sofa. The same sofa that we chose together in a furniture showroom where we once went with the whole family. Emily said that it would be so cozy to sit on it in the evenings when the children fall asleep, and we can watch TV shows under the blanket. Now this sofa seemed to mock me with its warm, soft comfort, while I was crushed by the thought, my wife is upstairs with another man. I put the ring next to it on the table and just stared at it, unable to take my eyes off it. Time seemed to slow down. I heard muffled moans from above, but they gradually died down, merging with the noise in my head. Maybe she didn't realize I was back yet, or maybe they didn't care. I barely breathed, too afraid to move. My head was buzzing. I didn't know what to think. Memories flashed before my eyes. Our first kiss in the car when we were students at Santa Clara University. Wedding anniversary dinner at a restaurant in downtown San Jose. The birth of her first son. I held her hand in the maternity hospital, and she looked at me as if we were on top of the world. And now I'm sitting alone with a bouquet of almost crushed lilies in my hands without a ring on my finger. Who am I now husband to? Am I tired of the family routine? Of course I was tired, but I didn't think it would all end like this in silence, without swearing, just shock, and that's it. I once remembered a fleeting conversation with a friend, Mike, who was divorced a long time ago. He said, "Adult life is full of pitfalls. If you don't work on your relationship, you'll most likely catch cheating sooner or later. So what should we do then? Everyone has their own decision. Maybe forgiven. Maybe I should leave. But at this moment, the main thing is to understand whether you are ready to live in such a state of mistrust." Then I brushed it off, answering something like, "Everything is fine with Emily." Apparently, I was wrong, or he just didn't want to notice the cracks. Sitting on the sofa, I finally let go of the bouquet from my hands, and the flowers rustled to the floor. The lilies were completely dented, some were broken. I looked at it and thought, what's going on upstairs now? Are they still doing their thing? A picture flashed before my eyes, Emily in my shirt, arching towards this guy whom she called Dave. Not that the name matters. I quietly ran my hand through my hair, feeling how everything was seething inside. But there was no desire to run either up or into the street. At the same time, I understood. This is only the beginning of the storm, the first minute after the thunderclap, when you still do not realize how strong the storm will be. I caught myself thinking, I need to at least even out my breathing. I tried to take a deep breath and exhale. This helped a little. I didn't shake as much as I thought I would. Maybe the body temporarily shut down from pain. Maybe I'll cry later. But now it seemed to me that I was looking at everything from the outside, like a film where the main character myself was experiencing the most humiliating moment in my life. There was a dull thud from above, as if something had been dropped on the floor. Then silence. I closed my eyes, trying to switch off. Somewhere in my pocket my phone was vibrating. Probably a work notification or a letter from a client had arrived. Irony, the work never ends. But now I don't care. A minute or two passed. The silence became even more ominous. Part of me wanted Emily to come down, see me, maybe get scared, cry and start making excuses, and the other part wanted to disappear, dissolve. Why am I still here? The thought flashed, but I couldn't get up. I didn't want to. It was like I was glued to this sofa. I remembered how Emily and I decided 4 years ago that we were the perfect couple. Then we won a trip to Las Vegas, spent the weekend in a luxury hotel, drank champagne, and laughed. "How happy we are," she said. "What happened now? Am I exhausted from work? Is she exhausted from home and children? Has she lost all interest in me? Or perhaps I didn't try to support her, didn't notice how she cried at night, didn't feel her loneliness." There were too many questions racing through my head. Time passed, but I continued to sit, staring at the ring on the table. It seemed foreign, as if I had found it on the street. I thought that if I made a sudden movement, something irreparable would begin. But while I remained on the sofa, the scene seemed to hang in uncertainty. Maybe I wanted to save this moment before I had to make a decision, so that I could stay in the illusion a little more. Then I suddenly heard someone stop below, behind the front door. My heart skipped a beat. Have the children really returned? No, they're at Grandma's. Most likely, the neighbor's dog went for a run or the postman left newspapers. Either way, I realized I couldn't sit here forever, but I still didn't have the strength to get up and start the debriefing. I looked down at my knees, and for the first time in a long time, I noticed how my figure had changed. I was always in shape, ran and went to the gym. And now, looking at my reflection in the phone screen, I noticed wrinkles around my eyes, A sagging shirt, apparently. I lost a couple of kilograms from constant business trips and stress. I started to look a little older and tired. And so, it turns out, while I was somewhere fighting for contracts, for new financing, life in my own home was going in some other way. Footsteps were heard from above, and then Emily's voice, "I'll get some water now, stay here." Water. They, apparently, after such a stormy scene, wanted to drink. My pulse jumped. She was going down. She walked straight towards me. Will she stop at the stairs, or will it go into the kitchen? I didn't know if I was ready to face her, mentally prepared, but at the last moment I noticed that there was partial shade in the living room. The curtains were drawn, and I was sitting like a ghost in the corner of the sofa, almost merging with the twilight. The light from the corridor was captured only by the floor lamp and part of the carpet. I heard her bare feet walking on the wooden floor of the hallway. She walked past, stopped literally a meter away, but did not look into the living room. Looks like she was too caught up in her own thoughts. She was still wearing my shirt, the same one open. In passing, I saw how the sleeves were falling off her shoulders. It was clear that she was in a hurry, even breathing quickly. At that moment, her phone, which was apparently in her pocket, made a short beep. Emily quickly pressed something, muttered under her breath, "Damn, this office again," and disappeared behind the kitchen door. I was sitting literally a few steps away. I heard her take out a glass and fill it with water from the filter. Then she trampled and returned back the same way. Her steps faded upstairs. I let out the air and realized that I had been holding my breath. Here she is, my wife, passed by, almost touched me with her presence, and did not notice. When silence enveloped the house again, I caught myself with a strange feeling of relief. As long as everything remained like this, nothing needed to be decided. But I knew that this was just a brief reprieve from reality. Finally, after maybe 10 or 15 minutes of sitting there in a daze, I looked down at my phone to see a bunch of notifications lit up on the screen. I didn't care. I exhaled and lowered my head, feeling a lump squeezing my throat and a traitorous tear sliding down my cheek. It was one tear, quiet, bitter, testifying that I was alive. Having suppressed the urge to get up and yell at them, I just continued to sit. All I could do now was stare at the wall. Suddenly, my gaze fell on a family photo standing on the nightstand. Emily and I were smiling. The children were hugging us. Taken just 6 months ago, during summer vacation at an amusement park. And today I felt like this was a snapshot from the lives of completely different people. A few minutes later, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my jacket. Then he slowly bent down, picked up the ring from the table, and squeezed it in his hand until it hurt. I heard my own hoarse whisper, "Well," but no ready-made solutions came to mind. I just realized that my life was split. What's next I can't know, but he knew one thing: there was no turning back. So I sat there, alone, lost, silently chewing this horror in my head. And so ended the day, which was supposed to be a surprise for my wife. Now I got a surprise. I sat in the living room, feeling like time stood still. Inside, everything was pulsating with quiet rage, but outwardly a strange detachment remained. I tried to breathe evenly, still clutching the removed wedding ring in my hand. The seconds passed agonizingly slowly. Footsteps were heard upstairs again. Judging by the sounds, someone went to the bathroom and then returned to the bedroom. It seemed to me that even the walls and the air knew. I'm here below, I hear every rustle, but I don't move. At some point, voices cut through the silence. They were muffled and unintelligible, but I caught the tense intonations. They seemed to be excitedly discussing something. Perhaps one of them looked out the window and saw my car near the house. Or she noticed the coat I left in the hallway. There was a feeling in the air. Now they would come down and find that I had been there all along. The minutes passed, but I did not move. Perhaps someone else would have rushed upstairs, torn the blanket off them, and started a fight. But it was as if there was a sudden change in me. There was no desire to shout, reproach, or prove anything. I just knew that I had to wait for the moment when their eyes met mine. Let them see me and realize that it's over. I didn't intend to argue with anyone. There was no longer any point. The footsteps came closer. I heard two people carefully descending the stairs, one confident, heavy, the second light, almost silent. Then I felt an electric shock when I caught Emily's confused breathing. The next moment, a man appeared on the threshold of the living room. Quite tall, strong, wearing an untucked shirt, obviously he hastily put it on, with unbuttoned jeans and still wet hair. His face expressed a mixture of curiosity and sudden fear. Emily stood a step behind him, pale, lips trembling slightly. She was still wearing my blue shirt, now somehow buttoned up. Red spots were visible on the chest traces of recent passion. Her hair was disheveled, and her eyes flashed with a belated realization. I was back, and, most likely, I saw everything, or at least knew what they were doing. "Mark," she began, stuttering, but then she bit her lip and didn't finish. I raised my head and stared at her lover. A second ago, he looked impudent, but now he saw that I was sitting calmly and staring at him without any fear. This confused him. "Listen, buddy." The guy began hoarsely, raising his hands as if he wanted to show his innocence. "There's some kind of misunderstanding." I stood up without taking my eyes off his face. "I won't be any kind of friend." With every step I took, he seemed to step back. His gaze darted. It was clear that deep down he was ready for a possible scandal. But I didn't mean to yell or wave my fists. "You," I said quietly, without raising my voice, "are now leaving my house." "Understood?" "Mark," Emily said again, "let me explain." I glanced at her just for a second, and it seems this look was enough for her to understand. I no longer want to hear any explanations. "Who are you anyway?" The lover growled, now more rudely, as if he had received a signal that I would not rush at him. His impudence probably returned when he noticed that I wasn't going to start a fight. He gave me a sharp look. "Hey, husband, maybe you need to calm down. We are adults, anything can happen." "I'm calm," I answered, and actually felt my heart beating surprisingly evenly. "But now you will leave. And believe me, you better not linger." "Maybe I don't want to leave." He chuckled briefly and glanced at Emily, as if asking, "What should I do now?" However, she was silent, only looking at the floor, hugging herself with her arms as if she was cold. I never thought I would see my wife like this. She stood and could not squeeze out a word in my defense, as if all this was not happening to her. Maybe she realized that her excuses were useless, or she still didn't believe that everything had already collapsed. "I give you exactly half a minute," I said, looking straight into this man's eyes, "to collect what you have here and leave. She and I have our own situation. We need to talk, and we don't need you." "Is that so?" His lips curled into a crooked grin, but I noticed that his hands were twitching nervously. He turned his head to Emily and, without looking away, added, "Do you think there's anything else in store for you with him? He's clearly—" "Shut up," I muttered. "Take yours and get out." At this moment, Emily suddenly stepped forward and touched her lover's shoulder. Her voice sounded muffled and trembled. "Dave, please, just go. Don't make things worse." The same expression froze on her face when a person is at a dead end and doesn't know what to do with himself. She ran her hand over her forehead, trying to stop the trembling. She looked pitiful and confused. She probably wanted to stop this shame, but she understood that words were unlikely to help. "Okay, baby," he breathed and moved towards the hallway, clearly deciding not to mess with me. "I hope you won't regret your choice." He slid past me. For the first time in all this time, I felt a wave of anger pass through my body, a hot pang of anger. I clenched my fists, but did not move. I didn't want to get dirty on it. While he was putting on his sneakers at the door, Emily stood nearby, as if not knowing how to behave. Then he turned around and looked in her direction. It seemed that he wanted to say something, either to say goodbye or to hurt me with his final ridicule, but he changed his mind. With a gesture, he pulled the zipper on his jacket, pushed the front door, and went out. I waited a couple of seconds, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade away. The house fell into an almost tangible silence. We were left alone. I was still standing in the passage between the living room and the corridor. Emily looked at me pleadingly, as if she was waiting for permission to justify herself. But I was not going to ask her for an explanation. Only one short remark escaped my lips. "All?" She swallowed, and I saw her eyes well up with tears. For some reason, I felt neither compassion nor pity. I just watched her trying to say something, and there was emptiness inside me. "Mark," she finally said, I don't know what came over me. It's me." She faltered, as if her tongue refused to form the right words. "Don't bother yourself," I said, turning around and walking into the living room. I suddenly wanted to move further away from her, as if her very presence was spoiling the air. "You know, everything is already clear to me." "No, you don't understand." Her voice began to break into tears. She followed me, trying to reach out to touch my back, but I pulled away. I just, I was unhappy. I felt that we were growing apart, and now, I'm not making excuses, it's all so confusing. I stopped abruptly and turned around. Our eyes met. Her face was distorted with pain and tears, and mine was stone motionless. Confused, I asked in a low voice, "Seriously, in my opinion, everything is very clear. You brought your lover to my bed, in my shirt, and not just like that, but of my own free will. I don't think there are any confusing circumstances here." "Mark," she clasped her hands to her chest, as if she was praying for mercy. Yes, I was mistaken. I was desperate. You were never at home. I lacked warmth and understanding. Dave just happened to be nearby. He said that I was beautiful and desirable. I didn't want it to go this far." "That's enough," I barked, although I tried to keep my voice even. He inhaled and exhaled again, trying to calm down. "I don't need to tell you these sob stories now." I saw what was happening up there. I heard everything. My gaze fell on her again, and for a moment I felt a sickening feeling, as if I was standing in front of a stranger who wore my wife's face. There was no desire to give her a chance to justify herself. "What will happen now?" she whispered. Tears flowed down her cheeks, her lips trembled. "Mark, children, our house." I walked out into the center of the living room, where crumpled lilies lay on the floor. They were already ruined, some of the petals were broken off, and water was leaking from the stems onto the carpet. I automatically lowered my gaze to this picture, feeling that symbolically it reflects our entire present. "Our house?" I asked again and looked at her. "You are no longer part of my home. From now on, he is only mine." This phrase sounded with icy clarity. I myself was surprised at how quickly and mercilessly it left my lips. But when I said this, I felt a strange relief inside. "Please," Emily sobbed. "I understand how it looks, but can't I try? I'm ready for anything. Just don't leave. Don't stop it like this. For everything." I gave her a sarcastic look. "Sorry, but I don't need this everything. You showed what you wanted, and I got it." "Mark," she screamed, took another step towards me, but I retreated. "I don't know what to do. I'm confused about my feelings, but I really didn't want to ruin our marriage." "Well, yes, you just wanted some variety." I smiled bitterly. "Or did you think that I was an eternal business trip idiot who wouldn't notice anything?" "No," she whispered, covering her face with her hands. "It was a mistake, such a terrible mistake. A mistake is when you run a red light or mix up the glasses at the bar," I said slowly, not taking my eyes off her. "And betrayal is a conscious decision, and you accepted it." I realized that I didn't want to hear a single word from her anymore. If I stay around for a few more minutes, I might lose my temper and tell her everything I think, and then I'll start to regret that I couldn't restrain myself from being angry. But I knew for sure there was no turning back. Everything inside me was already torn apart. "Get your things," I said, looking her straight in the eyes, "and leave." Tears flooded her even more. It seemed that she could not believe that I was so calmly, without hysterics, without the last hope, throwing her out the door. "Wait, maybe we should at least discuss how we will tell the children," she muttered through her sobs. I couldn't hold back a short laugh, bitter, sharp. "First of all, let's take some time with the children. Your mom still has them, right? This means that before they return, You have time to vacate the house. I don't want them to see you here, at least for now." She clasped her hands as if trying to stop shaking. "Mark, I will call, right." "Don't you dare," I interrupted her, feeling the cold words leaving my lips. "Don't call, don't write. I'm done with you. If you need to settle something legally, we will only talk through lawyers. All." She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something else, but then closed it. It seems that she finally realized that all her attempts to justify herself were being crushed by my icy determination. I looked at the wedding ring in my hand. The metal was cold on the palm. Then he unclenched his fingers, put the ring on the table next to the crumpled lilies, and turned away. "Go away," I repeated, clearly and clearly. "Just go away." I never thought before that I was capable of such detached cruelty. But at that moment, everything that was happening seemed to be the only way out. Either I'll kick her out now, or I'll start to feel like an idiot persuading my wife to return to the correct life. But I couldn't do that. I heard her exhale in despair. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that she was staggering, as if she was ready to fall to her knees. But I didn't even move. Let her hold on. When you betray a person, you should not expect care from him. She stood there for a minute, confused, then hurried towards the stairs. Apparently, she went to pack her things. Stayed in the living room. I felt empty, but at the same time experienced a strange relief. It was as if a weight that I had been unconsciously carrying for many years suddenly fell away. Yes, it was my marriage, my home, my memories, everything was going to hell, and yet a chill of clarity erupted inside me. The way back was cut off, and this had its own liberation. There was a knock from somewhere in the corridor. It seemed that she tripped over my travel bag, which I threw at the stairs when I entered the house. I didn't say anything. I just went to the kitchen and poured myself some water. My hands shook slightly as I raised the glass to my lips. Thoughts were racing. What will I do next? How will I tell everything to the children? Should I call my parents or anyone else now? But immediately these questions receded. I knew that the decision had already been made, and life itself had brought me to it. Perhaps someday I will understand exactly how we got to this point. But now I don't want any explanations or analysis. Maybe 10 minutes passed. Muffled sobs and the rustling of clothes were heard from above. I didn't even want to count exactly how many things she would take. If he wants, let him take away whatever he wants. The main thing is that she leaves on her own. Finally, she came downstairs with a small bag in her hands. I stood silently at the kitchen table, turning to the window. I felt her approach. The smell of her perfume, once beloved, now seemed suffocating. She began, but her voice broke. Apparently, she understood that any words were useless. I didn't turn around. He just said, "Close the door behind you." Nothing happened for a minute. She seemed to freeze in place, hoping that I would turn around or at least say something final. But I was silent. There are no more words left. There was emptiness and at the same time tired determination reigning in my soul. Then there were quiet steps, the sound of a door opening, a light draft touched my back, and then everything became quiet. I heard the lock click. It became even quieter, as if the whole world had decided not to disturb me anymore. After a while, I finally turned around and looked at the empty hallway. Her jacket had disappeared from the hanger, and a crumpled napkin lay nearby. Apparently, she was trying to wipe away her tears. Then my gaze fell on a bouquet of lilies lying on the carpet and my wedding ring abandoned on the table. I walked out of the kitchen and took a few steps, then knelt down and picked up the flowers. They were pale and lifeless, the stems were broken, the petals were crumpled. I suddenly remembered the phrase of the seller from the flower shop. Lilies are tremulous flowers, they need a lot of care, otherwise they will quickly wither. It's stupid, but these are the words that echoed in my memory now. Emily and I were also once something trembling, in need of care. But apparently, due to lack of attention, everything withered. Then I put my head in my hands and closed my eyes. The room seemed incredibly empty, although literally half an hour ago 3 people had collided in it. Me, my wife, and her lover. I couldn't believe that even in the morning I was thinking about a surprise for Emily, about family comfort, about restoring intimacy. And now I'm alone in absolute silence, holding broken lilies in my hand and trying to get used to the idea that my life will never be the same. The gaze fell on the ring. Out of habit, I reached out to him, but stopped in time. No, I won't wear it again. I picked up the metal round and clenched it in my fist, feeling that it no longer evoked any warm associations. No symbol, no deception. She is no longer part of my home, I repeated her same phrase to myself. And she knows it. For some reason, I did not feel any acute pain or burning resentment, only deep fatigue. I threw the ring back on the table, stood up and sat on the sofa, placing the lilies next to it. My throat felt raw, as if I had swallowed a bitter pill that would not dissolve immediately. But strangely enough, in this bitterness, there was an element of liberation. I caught myself thinking that now I am completely alone in my own home. And in this emptiness, in silence, a new feeling arose, a kind of cold freedom. I understood that there were a lot of difficulties ahead, conversations with children, probably with parents, explanations. But all this comes later. Now the most important thing has already happened. I broke the connection that for a long time I considered indestructible. Suddenly, I remembered how Emily and I once argued about where to go on vacation. I insisted on Europe, but she wanted to go to Hawaii. In the end, we gave in to each other and chose something in between a quiet beach spot on the coast of Mexico. Then this decision seemed like a compromise, a symbol of our love. It seemed that we knew how to negotiate and were meeting people halfway. But in reality, we were probably just smoothing out the cracks without noticing them. Now all the cracks have broken through. There is no point in pretending that you can return everything. I leaned back on the sofa and closed my eyes. How quickly people you trust crumble, I thought. And then it popped into my head that she was once the very person who gave me inspiration. I wrote her notes on napkins, sent her stupid stickers in instant messengers, and she laughed and sent cute hearts in response. Where is it all? I touched the phone and looked at the screen. Several missed messages from colleagues, a couple of notifications from the bank. Not a single call from Emily, of course. She knows that entrance is closed to her. Everything is correct. I felt an old anger stirring inside me. Why can't people be honest? Why did you have to humiliate me like that, and even in my house? But there were no answers. Only the facts remain. I got up and walked around the room. I looked at the wallpaper. We chose them together. I remembered how Emily stood with samples in her hands, smiled, and asked, "What do you think? Is this shade creamy or beige?" And I laughed. "Creamy is almost beige. Are you serious?" These memories made my heart ache, but I quickly returned to reality. I felt like I couldn't cry. Not because it doesn't hurt, but maybe he's already cried inside. It's not time for real tears yet. All the pain is still ahead. It will definitely catch up with me, but later when I will be alone behind a closed door and the memories will overwhelm my consciousness. For now, there was only coldness inside me. I sat down on the sofa again and covered my face with my hands. The last phrase she said was spinning in her head. "I'm ready for anything, just don't stop everything like that." Her voice sounded exhausted, as if she was ready to ask for forgiveness even on her knees. But to tell the truth, I long ago stopped believing that words can correct reality. This is not a random kiss at a corporate party, not a bad joke. This is a planned, conscious betrayal, and I don't want to find out how many times she brought him to the house before today, or where they met in secret. All this does not change the essence. Don't call, don't write. I'm done with you. These words rang in my ears. It's a little scary to realize what their man said, who spent 10 years side by side with her, raised children, built a life together. But sometimes relationships end just like that, with an icy cutting sentence. Through the window, the slanting rays of the morning sun fell on me. I suddenly noticed dust dancing in the air. How many times have we polished the floor here together, laughed when the children ran across the freshly washed boards? It's so strange to be alone now. But in this loneliness, perhaps, there is a bitter truth. It is better this way than pretending that nothing happened. I bent down and picked up the ring, which was again lying on the table. He ran his finger along the inside, where there had once been a small engraving. "Forever yours," it was written in English. Funny. I carefully pinched the wedding ring between my thumb and forefinger, looked at it one last time, and then put it in my pocket, as if to avoid being an eyesore. I don't know yet whether I'll throw it away, sell it, or just leave it as a memory of the past. But I definitely won't wear it again. There, upstairs in the bedroom, there was a rumpled sheet and fragments of other people's touches, their breath. I didn't want to go there, at least for now. I looked around. The house seemed suddenly too big, too empty. Usually it is at such moments that you want to call a close friend and pour out your whole soul. But I wasn't sure if I was ready to talk at all. Maybe I'll just sit down and sit in silence for the rest of the day, thinking about how to move forward with my life. I caught myself still mentally waiting for steps outside the door. Suddenly, she would come back, knock, and ask to be let in. But he immediately dismissed this thought. "No," I already said, "go away," and I won't take the words back. I have nothing more to say to her. I approached the window and looked out onto the street. Outside, life went on as usual. Cars drove by, neighbors passed by, not even suspecting what drama had just played out behind these walls. The world is indifferent to other people's troubles. This is probably for the best. For a minute, I silently looked into the distance. Then he pulled out his phone. A photograph appeared on the screen. Our family against the backdrop of the ocean, smiles, sun. I looked at this photo for a while, then slowly clicked on the screen and changed the screensaver. I didn't want to see us in the happy past anymore. Let these smiles remain in your memory if they haven't completely burned out. Closing my eyes, I took a deep breath. There was a debilitating silence in the house. Yet I realized that I no longer felt like a stranger in my own space. I am the owner of the house. I decide who should be in it. Today, I made a radical decision, and no matter how bitter it was, I knew it was no longer possible. Quietly crossing the threshold of the living room, I walked towards the corridor to go upstairs and somehow restore order in the bedroom. At the mere thought of what was left there after their joint caresses, everything inside sank. But apparently, right now, I must take the first step towards a new life. Start with clearing the space. Difficult conversations, documents, explanations to the children awaited me, but that would come later. In the meantime, I am alone in my house, and no word or oath binds me to her anymore. "It's over," I mentally repeated as I stepped onto the stairs. These words made me feel both painful and, in a strange way, free. It's been a little over 3 months since I last saw Emily at our doorstep. After her betrayal and our categorical separation, life began to roll in some new, unfamiliar direction to me. The children lived with me, and I tried my best not to let them feel the cracks that cut through our family. I no longer had her things in my house. I couldn't hear her voicemails. I even got used to the fact that the key that was previously ours is now only mine. Those months were full of difficult thoughts and restless nights, but every day I became convinced that I did not want to return to the past. Sometimes vague rumors came that Emily rented an apartment somewhere in another area of San Jose, worked intermittently, mostly remotely, and sometimes went to stay with a friend. There were no direct contacts. She strictly complied with my requirement not to call or write. And yet, despite the pain of the breakup, life moved forward. One evening, after I had put the children to bed, the doorbell rang briefly and nervously. I hesitated. Usually no one came at such a late hour. He slowly stood up, walked into the hallway, and opened the door. Emily stood in front of me. She looked different. His face was drawn, there were circles under his eyes, and his hair was carelessly tied into a ponytail. Her appearance indicated that she lived in some kind of constant stress, the kind that cannot be washed away by either a shower or tears. "Hello," she just said, looking somewhere over my shoulder, as if she was afraid to meet my gaze. I was silent, not knowing what to answer her. A strange woman on the threshold of my house, and at the same time the mother of my children. When our painful pause began to drag on, she apparently gathered her courage. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, shifting from foot to foot. My first instinct was to answer, "No, you have no right to cross this threshold." But suddenly a strange feeling came over me. She looked as if she was about to faint from weakness or nervous tension. I didn't want to argue at night, in front of the children, so I stepped aside and she entered. We walked into the living room, where the soft light of the floor lamp barely illuminated the space. I didn't ask her to sit down. She sat down on the edge of the sofa, hunched over and lowered her head. For the first time in a long time, I looked at her carefully, and I noticed how her fingers were shaking. "Speak," I said quietly, trying not to sound rude, but there was no warmth in it either. Emily still looked at the floor, then sighed and said, "I'm pregnant. Almost 3 months, and damn it, I don't know from whom." I felt as if an invisible string had been broken inside me. My throat constricted, and something sank in my chest as painfully as if I had been stabbed. It seemed as if I could hear the roar of my own blood in my ears. But outwardly nothing. The same frozen gaze, the same stone mask on his face. "From whom?" I asked automatically, although she had already said that she didn't know. My thoughts were racing wildly. The calculation was simple. If it's 3 months, then there's a real chance that the child could be mine. Or, conversely, Dave the same one. "Mark." She finally looked at me, and her eyes flashed with pain. "I found out about this recently. I had health problems, and I went to the doctor. Everything became clear there. At first I thought I would have an abortion, but I couldn't make up my mind, and I end up sitting here in front of you, not knowing what to expect." My heart jumped in my chest. The picture flashed through my head at breakneck speed. How she, left alone, was fiddling with tests, trying to figure herself out. How did she feel when she found out that she could carry my child or someone else's? I looked at her silently for several seconds. The words seemed stuck in my throat. I wanted to scream, scold, accuse. But suddenly I realized that I didn't want to throw it all out. I already expressed everything on the day of her betrayal, and now I was overcome not by rage, but by a feeling of acute, dull impasse. "And what do you want from me?" I finally said. Emily closed her eyes and shook her head. "Don't know. I just want to understand if this child has a father who—" She stopped short. "Even if I'm a father," I answered harshly, "you and I are not a couple." She nodded, as if agreeing with this without any protest. Then she clenched her hands, clasping her fingers so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I understand. And I'm not asking you to return me. I'm not begging for love. But—" Her eyes filled with tears, and she swallowed before continuing. "I'm confused. I'm scared. I don't know what to do alone. And I can't tell my mother. She can barely cope with my actions. Dave, he's out of sight. Maybe he doesn't want a child. Maybe he moved altogether. I don't even know." There was a painful pause in the room. I tried to grasp the absurdity of the situation. The woman I had kicked out for cheating might be pregnant with my child. But she doesn't know for sure if this is my child. "Have you done the test?" I asked finally, losing myself in cold formalities. Maybe they have some ways to establish paternity at an early stage. "Yes," she nodded. "But this is still not a 100% guarantee for such a short period, and it costs a lot of money. Plus, there are certain risks for the fetus. I was told that it would be more accurate to do it later when the pregnancy is a little more advanced, or after the birth of the child." I ran my hand over my face. Blood was pounding in my temples, and the thought was spinning in my brain. How did I get myself into this? But there's no way around it anymore. So what should I do? I asked quietly, rather rhetorically. She didn't answer. She just sobbed quietly, squeezing the sleeves of her thin jacket. She looked really depressed, nervous, exhausted. I suddenly realized that despite all my anger towards her, I could not drive her pregnant woman out onto the street. And although the head still resisted any indulgences, the heart whispered, "What if this is your child?" We sat in tension-filled silence for several long minutes. Then I stood up and, without saying a word, walked out of the living room into my office. He locked the door, sat down at the table, and buried his face in his hands. It didn't get any easier. I realized that I had to make a decision. I didn't sleep a wink all night. Thoughts, memories, fears were seething in my head. How to explain her return to the children? How can I live under the same roof with a person I don't want to see? But at the same time, my consciousness insisted, if this is your child, you have no right to abandon him. You must give him a chance to be born in more or less normal conditions. In the morning, I left the office feeling like I had blue circles under my eyes and a fog in my head. The children were already up and eating cereal at the kitchen table. When they saw me, they smiled, but immediately noticed my confused expression and fell silent. Emily was nowhere to be seen. I realized she had probably spent the night on the couch. Having gathered my will into a fist, I quickly sent the children to school. Fortunately, we had an agreement with a neighbor. He dropped them off in the car along the way. As the door closed behind them, I turned around and saw Emily in the doorway. She apparently listened to how I interacted with the children. She was wearing the same sweater. She clearly had not slept. I won't beg you for anything, she said quietly, staring at the floor, as if afraid to look me in the eyes. If you tell me to leave, I will leave. I just couldn't live alone in fear anymore. This is probably stupid of me. I stood opposite her, resting my palms on the edge of the table. Then he still squeezed out. Stay, but not for you. Her shoulders shook. It seemed she wanted to answer something, but I continued, not letting her speak. Only for the sake of the child, I said harshly. If this is my child, I want him to be in normal conditions. But we live in different rooms. We're not a couple. No, trying to get everything back. Understand? She pursed her lips and nodded. Of course, she whispered. Thank you. Don't thank me. And keep in mind, I haven't forgiven you, I added. Most likely, I won't forgive you. I'm only doing this because there's a chance that this child is mine. I don't care if you love me or not. I just want to make sure he's going to be okay. Emily closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. But I didn't feel any regret. My whole heart was shackled with a sharp cold. Thus began our new, strange life under one roof. I gave her a room on the second floor, the one that had once been my workroom, but had been empty for a long time because I had set up an office on the first floor. The children asked in bewilderment, "Does Mom live with us again now? Why don't you talk normally then?" We had to somehow explain that my mother now has health problems and she needs us to take care of her. To the question, "Have you made peace?" I answered evasively, "Adults sometimes help each other, even if there are no particularly friendly relations." The sons, of course, felt the tension, but they seemed to accept the situation, because it was simply important for them to see their mother nearby. Emily remained extremely quiet. She almost didn't communicate with me. Apparently, she felt that every word I said was reeking of detachment. But I caught how she tries to compensate for the children for her long absence. She reads books to them, puts them to bed, and tries to be gentle. The children, bored, reached out to her, at the same time trying to understand why there was such a wall between us. I did everything to make the "we are not a couple" rule obvious. My bedroom remained my fortress, and hers remained the place where I did not look. We didn't have dinner together, either with the children, or I ate all together later, when she had already come down, took the plate, and went to her room. However, I could not completely abstract myself. After all, if she really was carrying my child, I wanted to make sure that she was eating normally, that she had vitamins, that she was not worried beyond measure. As if obeying an internal duty, I brought her food or asked in the evening, "Have you passed the tests? When is your next consultation with a doctor?" She answered quietly, without objection, and sometimes showed test results. She had low hemoglobin and mild anemia, a standard thing for pregnant women. I bought the necessary drugs and left them in the kitchen. I tried to see if she was eating, but without being too soft. Sometimes she tried to say, "Thank you," looking for my reaction with her eyes, but I just nodded coldly. I didn't want to build bridges. I didn't do this for her sake. The nights turned into torture for me. As soon as I was left alone in the dark, thoughts began to torment me. What if the child is not mine? I spent all this effort, let her back in, and then it turns out that this child is a stranger. What should I do then? Will I kick her out again? Or will I suddenly have time to get used to the child? And vice versa. And if the child is mine, can I raise him with hatred for his mother in my soul? How will he feel growing up in such an atmosphere? My head seemed to be pounding with doubts and future scenarios. I slept for 3 to 4 hours, often waking up in a cold sweat. The back of my head hurt and my concentration at work dropped. Colleagues noticed that I became harsh, sometimes even rude. One day, after lunch, I went into the room that I had given to Emily. I needed to clarify something about the documents that came in my name. I knocked briefly and heard her yes. I walked in and saw her sitting on the bed, hugging her knees. There were medications on the nightstand nearby. "Are you feeling bad?" I asked, keeping my tone even, but still feeling worried. "Just a little nauseous," she replied, turning away. I breathed slowly. Doctors said that toxicosis could be. I crumpled the envelope I was holding in my hands. "This came in your name," I said, handing her the letter. She nodded and took the paper. Then, as if daring, she looked up. "You know, I won't bother you if—" "You're not bothering me anyway," I interrupted. "Just follow what we agreed on." "Okay," she whispered and bit her lip, clearly holding back tears. At that moment, I felt like everything inside was shrinking from absurd pain. She was really depressed and lonely, and lived among people who were not happy about her. But I sternly reminded myself that these were all consequences of her choices. It's not for me to feel sorry for her. "Do you have everything you need?" I asked, turning my gaze to her empty glass on the nightstand. "I think so," she said quietly. "Thank you for the vitamins and everything else." I nodded curtly and turned to leave. She suddenly added quietly, "Mark, if you want to talk, I'm ready to tell you everything that happened and how it came to this." I stopped at the door and, without turning around, answered, "I don't need this. I understood everything even when I found you together." After these words, I closed the door and left, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Was I too harsh? Perhaps, but I simply couldn't do it any other way. So we lived on in a strange balance of alienation. The more I closed myself off, the more she fell into silence. Time passed, and her pregnancy was doing its job: weakness, ailments, and sometimes a slight fever. I made sure that there was normal food in the refrigerator and periodically bought fresh fruits and vegetables. I left the bags in the kitchen and she picked them up herself. In the evenings, locking myself in my room, I listened to the silence of the house. From there, from her room, quiet sobs could sometimes be heard, as if she was crying. I tried not to pay attention. My position was tough. "You are not here for reconciliation, but to bear the child in safety." Of course, the children felt the tension. The eldest son, Robbie, once timidly asked me, "Dad, why don't you talk to Mom at the table? We all live together now." I had to briefly explain, "Mom and I decided that it's better this way now. This doesn't affect your life in any way, son. It's not your fault." It was enough for little Ted that his mother again read him fairy tales before bed, and he happily ran to her as soon as he heard her voice. Another few tense weeks passed. Life in the house continued to look paradoxical. Emily and I were essentially together, but each in his own room. Children try to keep in mind two mutually exclusive facts. Mom and Dad are under the same roof, but there are no kind words or familiar comfort between them. And in addition, everything hangs on that unexplained pregnancy that bound us more tightly than any formal ties. One evening, my friend Mike came to see me. He knew only part of the details. I didn't go into details, but he mentioned big problems in the family, and that Emily was with me now. He looked at me searchingly and asked, "Listen, have you even tried to solve all this through therapy?" "Therapy?" I snorted, leaning back in my chair. "Do you think a conversation specialist will help us?" "I understand your disbelief," he admitted, "but sometimes a therapist is needed not to save a marriage, but to figure out how people got to such an abyss. At least this might give you some clarity." I just shook my head, making it clear that I doubted it. Then, in conversations with colleagues, the topic of psychological help came up a couple more times. In the end, as often happens, the total pressure of external opinions did its job. At the same time, our pediatrician, having heard out of the blue that my mother is now pregnant and there is a crisis in the family, cautiously suggested contacting a family psychologist, not necessarily to reunite. It can also be for better mutual understanding, she explained. After all, there are children in the house, and soon, perhaps, another child. At first, I waved it off. But one day, looking at Emily sitting at the kitchen table with a paper mug of tea, she was now constantly drinking something to stop the attacks of nausea, I realized that our short conversations revolved around the same thing. Do you need to see a doctor? What are the test results? How are you feeling? And nothing more. There is no understanding at all. Why did we collapse? When exactly did this crack appear? And how did I pressure her so much that she allowed herself to betray? Perhaps Mike was right. Sometimes you need a third person even if I don't like it. One evening, already putting the children to bed, I went out into the corridor and, seeing Emily, said without much preamble, "We were recommended to a psychologist. Maybe we can try." She shuddered slightly. It was clear that she did not expect it. Then she whispered, "If you want. I I don't know if it will help, but I agree." We both understood that this was not a second chance. Rather, an attempt to understand how we got to such darkness. The psychologist, a woman in her 40s, received us in a small, bright room at the Psychological Assistance Center. There are pastel colors on the walls, cozy armchairs, and soft light. At first glance, I had a strong desire to escape. This whole space looked too calm. Emily sat with a haunted look, clutching a pillow in her lap, and I, as it turned out, looked tense and perhaps aggressive. "Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Green." The psychologist politely introduced herself. We greeted each other stiffly, avoiding looking at each other. The first sessions were marked by mutual irritation and silence. The doctor tried to get us to talk. "How do you feel when you think about your relationship?" I smiled wryly. Emily fell silent, as if afraid to open her mouth. Only at the end of the second or third visit did I break down. I said that I felt humiliated, deceived, that I had been living in illusions all this time. Emily almost burst into tears, but instead of tears, she suddenly spoke caustically. "You were always busy with work. I felt like nobody was next to you. You only needed my functions at home, cooking, cleaning, raising children. What then is the difference between me and a maid?" I was about to respond with harshness to harshness, but the psychologist stopped us and asked us to talk about feelings and not about accusations. It looked ridiculous. We were both on edge, almost hissing at each other. Nevertheless, the sessions continued. The doctor sometimes asked leading questions, sometimes asked us to do small homework, for example, write what we value in another, or what fears we experience. I was skeptical about this, but the further I went, the more I realized this tangle cannot be unraveled just like that. At one of the sessions, Emily, at first muttering, then breaking into a scream, burst out. "I always felt that you were blocking me. You make a career, you easily achieve success, you succeed in everything right away, and I was just there, not keeping up with you. I felt like I was getting lost in everyday little things, and you didn't even notice it." I clenched my fists tensely. "Do you think it was easy for me? I worked for days to provide for my family, and it seemed to me that this was how I proved my love to you. Didn't I give you freedom? You yourself wanted to stay at home with the children." "Yes, at first I wanted to," she shouted, "and then I realized that I was going crazy from loneliness and my own uselessness. But you didn't see me drowning." It was a tough conversation, but I finally started to get the message. At some point, we both stopped talking about how we felt. I went to work, believing that this was my way of showing concern. She closed herself off in her resentment towards me, believing that I was too cool and did not notice her needs. And then there were distortions, misunderstandings, accumulated irritation, and as a result, her betrayal, which became an explosion. The therapist, listening to our accusations, said, "Each of you wanted to be understood, but it seems you didn't talk about the pain out loud." And silence and detachment destroyed trust. The sessions did not make us closer as a couple, but we learned to understand what the reasons were. I didn't say I forgive her. No. But if earlier I only saw her as a traitor, now I began to guess what internal impasse she found herself in. This did not justify cheating, but at least it made it possible to realize that everything was not as banal as she just wanted someone else. The weeks passed. Emily has already passed the 4th month of pregnancy, and despite my strict, "we are not together" attitude, we increasingly collided in the kitchen, exchanging a few words not only about health. At times we both realized that we were still connected by common memories, common children. This led to strange moments when I found myself watching her tie her son's ponytail and remembering what she was like when we first met. One day, late in the evening, we were returning together from Dr. Green after another session. The children stayed with a neighbor to play. There was tense silence in the car. I parked at the house, got out, and helped her lift her heavy bag with documents, and at some point our hands touched. She looked up at me in the semi-darkness of the yard. Her face seemed unrecognizable, and suddenly I felt a long-standing desire, mixed with pain, blazing inside. This contact lasted a split second. I realized I had to pull away, but suddenly her hand slid over mine, and the kiss happened by itself, awkward, incoherent. It seemed like we both didn't understand why we were doing this. My lips met hers, harshly and without tenderness. At that very moment, I recoiled as if I had been burned. She unclasped her fingers, looking at me in confusion. "I'm sorry," I breathed out. "I don't." "It's okay," she said quickly, although there were tears in her eyes. "Forget." We silently entered the house. Everything inside me was burning with mixed feelings, an acute resentment that had not yet subsided, and a lingering desire that, apparently, had been living in me all this time. But this spark, instead of giving us some kind of warmth, caused a new wave of awkwardness. At night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I left the bedroom to drink water. I noticed that the light in her room was on. My heart began to beat. As if driven by some inner impulse, I walked along the corridor and pushed the slightly open door. Emily sat on the bed, looking at one point, and quiet tears flowed down her cheeks. "Why aren't you sleeping?" I asked in a low voice, deafly. She looked up at me, full of confusion. "I can't. I feel sick, and my head hurts. And this kiss, it shook everything up." I stood next to her and felt that I was drawn to her with an irresistible force. It pulls, despite all the bitterness, despite the fact that I kept telling myself, no feelings. Unbearable internal pain mixed with despair and physical need. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and our eyes met, naked pain in every glance. She reached out to me slightly, as if seeking touch, and I restrainedly, almost violently, pulled her closer. Our lips closed again, without tenderness, with a dull groan. We kissed as if we were trying to throw out all the resentment and dependence that connected us through this contact. My fingers grabbed her shoulders. Her hands trembled and slid along my neck. This moment, filled with feelings of rage and desire, shifted to the dimly lit bed. We didn't say a word. Breathing became heavy and intermittent. She clenched the sheet in her fist as I pulled her close to me. Everything happened abruptly, almost rudely, as if each of us wanted to quench a long-accumulated thirst, and at the same time cause pain to each other. Yes, it was an act of intimacy, but not at all about love in the classical sense. More likely about an attempt to break the tension that suddenly spilled out. I felt her trembling body and heard her heavy exhalations. Everything was boiling inside me: unforgivable resentment, hidden melancholy, and acute attraction to her, accumulated in spite of everything. We moved in the semi-darkness, clutching each other, almost forgetting that she was pregnant. But at some point, I still stopped, pulled away for a moment, and carefully but decisively supported her back. She pressed herself against me so that it seemed she wanted to dissolve in this impulse, to forget all the pain and shame. Not a single tender word was spoken, only dull, passionate sounds, reflecting an inexplicable mixture of despair and passion. When it was all over, we lay there, breathing heavily, exhausted not only physically, but also emotionally. I felt her heart beating, and mine was beating in rhythm. A strange silence enveloped us. There was no sweetness in this silence, rather, the same unresolved pain, but now mixed with a short-term feeling of relief. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not knowing what exactly I meant in this word. "Did you apologize for the rudeness or for the very fact of intimacy?" She remained silent. I felt her tears on my collarbone, but she didn't pull away. On the contrary, she quietly wrapped her arms around my arm, as if looking for at least a tiny bit of security for these short minutes. After some time, I got up and sat on the edge of the bed. Chaos was going on in my head. What now? Pretend I'm distant again. What if this happens again? What have we achieved with this sudden, violent intimacy? But he didn't ask out loud, and she, it seems, also did not dare to speak. I pulled on some of my clothes, sighed somehow through clenched teeth, and said barely audible, "You need to rest." She nodded, turning to the wall. I froze for a moment, watching her shoulders shake slightly. Perhaps she was crying again, but I was unable to both console and break this vicious circle. He left her room and quietly closed the door, as if afraid to frighten the silence of the night. He returned to his room and fell on the bed. My heart was beating wildly. Everything in my chest ached from the realization that we were no longer the same people who could once make love with tenderness and trepidation. Now our entire intimacy is a mixture of passion and anger that has burst out, dependence, a puncture in the defense, a broken state in which we want to either punish or console each other. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Her lips burned from her kisses, her memory retained hoarse moans, but even greater discord reigned in her soul. I understood. We seemed to have crossed a certain line. But whether this will lead to the restoration of feelings is unknown. Rather, it opened a new round of our painful connection. And questions came into my head again, the answers to which I could not find. What are we now? Why did this happen? Will we be able to trust each other even just a little, or will everything remain a ball of pain and passion? Oddly enough, there was no answer. There was only fatigue, mixed with latent hope for some kind of continuation, albeit tragic. Long months passed during which Emily and I maintained a semblance of calm, mostly for the sake of the children. They saw that Mom and Dad lived under the same roof, communicated smoothly and without quarrels, although there was still a gulf between us. On the outside, everything looked tolerable, almost decent, but inside everyone was seething with their own fears and doubts. After that fierce night of intimacy, I no longer touched her. At first I could not even look into her eyes, remembering how we merged in a passionate, but full of pain, impulse. She also tried to keep her distance, apparently feeling that any new rapprochement would only worsen the confusion. During this time, her pregnancy came very close to the end. Her stomach became noticeably rounder, her gait became slower, her gaze became more tired. There were moments when she needed my help, but I tried to do it without unnecessary emotions, as dryly as possible. I took her to the clinic, brought water when she felt dizzy, kept my sons away if my mother needed to lie down in silence. The children, although they felt the tense atmosphere, were glad that their mother no longer left home. They were waiting for a brother or sister to appear and asked me, "How soon? Shall we play with him?" I nodded, smiled, but uncertainty was gnawing inside. What if the child is not mine? Technically, we decided to wait for the DNA test after birth, because early on doctors advised against taking risks. All this time we continued to go to sessions with Dr. Green. The sessions helped us speak more civilly than brought us closer together. In our general conversations, the word duty was often heard. I felt responsible for the child. She felt responsible for correcting, as far as possible, the consequences of her own decisions. But there was no talk of love, of preserving the family. The deep wounds have not yet healed. One day, when the due date on the calendar was already approaching, Emily suddenly sat down on the sofa with a groan and said that she was beginning to experience strange cramping pains. I quickly realized that it was time to go to the maternity hospital, although the deadline was a little earlier than the official date. The first reaction was confusion, because I remember how it happened with our first two sons, but then we were a young couple, happy, and now everything is different. However, at a critical moment, old habits persisted. I quickly packed her bag, checked her documents, and arranged for the children to stay with a neighbor for now. We got into the car, and I took her to the local hospital. Chaos was going on inside me. My heart was pounding. The thought was beating in my head. What if this is not my child after all? But when I saw Emily wince in pain, I cast aside my fears and focused on helping her. At the reception department, we were quickly processed. The nurses took her to the maternity ward, and I mechanically followed. Although we were not a couple in the full sense, she is the mother of my sons, and now possibly a third child. And judging by Emily's look, she wanted me to be there, at least now, in this painful and important moment. As the contractions became stronger, Emily could hardly contain her scream. Doctors asked if she wanted pain relief, and she eventually agreed to an epidural. But even with her, the birth was not easy. The baby was clearly in a hurry to appear, and her body seemed not to be ready. I stood at a distance, trying not to disturb the doctors. "Mark," she suddenly whispered, extending her hand to me. "Please." This call sounded so sincere that without hesitation, I walked up and placed my palm in hers. She squeezed my fingers with unexpected strength. Previously, when we were spouses without any discord, this was a natural gesture of mutual support. Now I felt a burning surge of emotions, guilt, responsibility, and the same persistent thought, what if he's not mine? "Breathe," was all I could say, remembering how during a previous birth I taught her to breathe correctly. "Everything will be fine." "Mark," she repeated chokedly through the contraction, "forgive me for everything." My heart sank. I didn't know what to answer, and I didn't have time. The doctors were already ordering her to push. My hand went numb from her grip. A few frantic seconds, and the shrill cry of a newborn was heard. An immediately familiar and at the same time goosebumps alien sound. The doctors quickly ran in and announced that it was a boy. Emily lay back on her pillow, wet with sweat, her eyes sunken, but a look of relief flashing across her face. I froze for a moment, watching the nurses deftly tie the umbilical cord and dry the tiny body. I remembered how 5 and 9 years ago I greeted the arrival of my eldest sons. Then a wave of joy washed over me. Now I felt a mixed storm of tenderness for the child and internal acute anxiety. The nurse wrapped the baby in a blanket and brought it to us. Emily stretched out her arms. She wanted to hug her son, but she was too weak. I automatically helped, and we held the baby together. Seeing him clench his tiny fists and weakly blink his dull eyes, it melted a piece of ice inside me. No matter what happens, this baby should have a normal life. A few minutes later, the doctors suggested that I go out and give Emily a rest. I went out into the corridor, feeling like my legs were like cotton. A wave of memories came over me, our joint birth, dazzling joy, and now, I cannot fully share this moment. After all, without the DNA result, I didn't know if this baby was really my son. Emily stayed in the hospital for a couple of days, as usual after giving birth. I visited her and arranged for the children to come with me to see their newborn brother. They were delighted and declared in unison how similar he is to us. But in the maternity hospital, tiny children rarely resemble anyone particularly clearly. I understood this. Emily looked exhausted, but happy and excited at the same time. She behaved with restraint in front of me, for which I was grateful to her. I didn't want a scene. The nurses took the child for examinations and vaccinations, and Emily and I looked at each other with painful thoughts. I knew that after discharge, another important step awaited us, establishing paternity. Doctors, at our request, took a test from the baby. In the coming days, it should have become clear who the father was. The time until the results arrived stretched out like an endless rubber band. Emily was lying in the ward, feeding the baby, who was crying tirelessly and demanding attention. I brought her food, helped her change her diapers, and changed her small diapers. I did everything mechanically as if I already knew how to handle a newborn, but my soul did not lie still. I could not allow myself to fully open up and feel happy emotions as I did with my first sons. The words loomed in my head. What if it's not yours? One evening, when it was already dark, I sat on a plastic chair next to her bed and watched as she put the baby down after feeding. The boy was breathing heavily, sniffling through his nose. And suddenly I felt a pang in my chest. This sound reminded me of how our middle son snorted in the same way in infancy. He had narrow nasal passages. Maybe it's just a coincidence, flashed through my head. Or maybe this is really my child. Mark, Emily said quietly, noticing where I was looking. Thank you for being there. I know things here are complicated, but you still care. I just shrugged my shoulders without turning around. I didn't want her to see how nervous I was. The results should come tomorrow, she continued. I'm afraid. Why be afraid? I asked bitterly. If it turns out that the child is not mine, then everything is obvious. If it's mine, everything is also obvious. She did not specify what exactly would be obvious to us. Perhaps I held back my emotions because, on the one hand, I wanted him to be my son, because this would mean that we have another related thread. On the other hand, I was afraid of precisely this result, because then my whole life would completely turn upside down, and I would have to decide how to raise my son, and at the same time continue to live with a person you don't trust. When I was called to the doctor the next day, my hands were literally shaking. Emily was with the baby, she was left in the room, and I was taken to a small treatment room where the doctor was already waiting with a folder. Good afternoon. You are Mark, right? I nodded, unable to say a word. We have the result of the paternity test. Officially, everything is written down in this document. Want to read it yourself? He handed me a sheet. Dry numbers and letters did not immediately form into understandable phrases. I glanced over. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. It seemed that I was reading some other person's text, but the meaning was clear. The child is mine. I felt a fever and then a sharp chill. I slowly looked up at the doctor, and he nodded in understanding. In a somewhat muffled voice, I thanked him, signed a few papers, and went out into the corridor. The world seemed to float. I wanted to cry, laugh, and scream. Now no doubt could justify my detachment. This is my son, I am his father, and I can't just walk away from this. Squeezing the piece of paper in my hand, I staggered towards the room. Emily was waiting for me, sitting on the edge of the bed. Seeing me appear, she took a closer look at everything. I silently handed her the paper. She took it, looked, and cried quietly, pressing her fist to her lips. Relief and fear were mixed in her gaze because she understood that now this was an inevitable reality for me. So, she whispered, looking at the baby, who was quietly snoring in the incubator nearby, he's yours, Mark. I went up to the incubator and ran my finger over the blanket in which our son lay. The baby, as if sensing my presence, stirred, wrinkled his tiny nose, and let out a short sigh. My heart sank from the tenderness that suddenly overflowed. Yes, he's mine, I said dully. Emily wanted to add something, but remained silent, apparently afraid of disturbing the fragile moment. Without saying a word, I carefully took the newborn in my arms. He was so small, defenseless, dependent on me. Now I couldn't deny our connection. No matter how painful our rift with Emily was, this child is not to blame for our mistakes. He deserves to have a loving father. Standing with my son in my arms, I understood that there were many questions ahead. How to live, what to do with relationships, can I forgive her, and she can forgive herself. But at that moment, all doubts faded into the background. I only felt a huge responsibility and a strange liberation. I no longer had to suffer from suddenly not being mine. Now everything is clear. This means that we need to find the strength to take care of him, to give him everything he needs, just as I give to my older children. What should we call him? Emily whispered, apparently having calmed down from her tears. We didn't discuss names. I carefully lowered the baby back and looked at her. I don't know, he admitted honestly. We need to think about it. You can call me the way you wanted, if you have any ideas. She looked away as if embarrassed. Then she named a couple of options. They sounded unusual to me, but I didn't object. We'll see. Surely the children will also offer their ideas. They always want the name to be cool. A nurse looked in the door and asked if everything was okay. We nodded at the same time. I felt that I did not want to have long conversations here in the hospital room. Now the child's peace of mind and Emily's physical recovery are more important. We will postpone all discussions about the future for at least a few days. I have to go to work, I said chokedly, although, to be honest, I couldn't work. My brain was filled with emotions. I'll arrive in the evening and bring you something from home. She nodded briefly, following me with her gaze. There was humility in that look and a quiet desire that I would not disappear. But I left, clutching the envelope with the results. Now everything has changed. The child is definitely mine. Afterward, when I got into the car and started the engine, a wave of tears almost washed over me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, remembering the faceless letters, 99.999%. What a strange feeling to learn from a cold scientific result that you are now a father for the third time. Perhaps it was inevitable. Even if DNA had shown otherwise, life would have taken a different path. But now, knowing the truth, I understood that I would have to make decisions on which our destinies depended. Later in the evening, after the children had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, holding that same piece of paper with the result in my hands. He peered at the lines, although he knew them by heart. He is my son. Repeating this to myself, I felt both a bitter pang and some timid relief. I had another child. A boy who would probably look like me, like the older boys, and maybe with Emily's features. Will he, when he grows up, want to understand why mom and dad lived like this in the first months of his life? Emily was still in the hospital. I agreed that I would pick her up with the baby tomorrow afternoon. She didn't ask me for anything else and didn't beg for a reunion. She probably already understood that the main question now is whether we will reconcile. But will I be able to discern in her a person who not only sinned, but also repented? The path to this is debt, if at all possible. But I was absolutely sure of one thing. No matter what the outcome awaited us, this child would receive my father me, and I will not give it up under any pretext. Rather, he will have to break himself, break previous attitudes, and again arrange his life taking into account his interests. It won't be easy, but when you're holding a newborn tiny creature in your arms, it's impossible to deny your responsibility. With all these thoughts, I sat almost until late at night, peering into the penumbra of the living room. Images of the baby, Emily, and my older sons flashed before my eyes. It is unknown what will happen to our future together, but one thing is clear. From that day, my life changed completely. Only a week has passed since Emily returned from the maternity hospital, and I finally confirmed the paternity of my third child. She and the baby moved into the same room upstairs where they lived during the last months of pregnancy. My older sons were now vying with each other to run there to touch their little brother's hand, make funny faces, or just watch him sniffle sweetly in his sleep. The house gradually came to life with the sounds of a newborn, and at the same time, there was still an uneasy distance between Emily and me. We didn't talk to each other about love, there were too many wounds. They were not tender and reverent. The pain was still too fresh. But we both behaved quietly, without the previous aggression. Perhaps being close to such a fragile creature, our son, absorbed all the negative outbursts. It seemed to me that the presence of the baby obliges us to some kind of truce, albeit without loud words about forgiveness. In rare moments, when the house became calm, the children were playing in the yard, and the baby was sleeping, I went into her room. He sat on a chair at the head of the bed and watched as she carefully shifted her tiny son from one hand to the other and checked the diaper. At such moments, the silence became almost tangible. One evening, after both older boys had gone to bed and the newborn was asleep, I knocked softly on the door. Emily opened the door and motioned for her to enter. The room was semi-dark, only the night light emitted a soft light. The baby was dozing in a cradle next to her bed. I sat on the edge of the chair, ran my hand over the cradle, and noticed how the baby shrank, but did not wake up. One thought was pounding in my head. Now he is definitely my son, and I must learn to rebuild my life next to his mother, although there are no guarantees that I will be able to completely trust her again. Emily and I exchanged a brief glance. There was a hurricane of feelings in this look. Resentment, remorse, gratitude, fatigue, fear. It's not like we have a magical solution to all problems. Rather, the senseless quarrels died down because now I had to think about my son and about the older children too. At some point, I suddenly extended my hand to check if the baby's feet were too cold. Emily pulled away, but then reluctantly allowed me to cover the baby with the blanket. When I looked up at her, she said almost in a whisper, "You know, I would like to fix everything, but I won't promise something that I can't deliver." The words sounded simple, without a plea, without hope for a quick, happy ending. I felt the familiar bitterness. Once we were a family without ulterior motives, and now we talk like people who hardly reach out to each other across the abyss. Maybe that's right, I breathed. No promises. She nodded. Silence once again covered us with a heavy blanket. I turned my gaze to my son. He was so tiny that the moments of the birth of my elders immediately surfaced in my memory. We always rejoiced together. We chose tiny socks, laughed about how to wash our cheeks correctly. Now everything is different, but the child was still born. His presence in the house is an irreversible reality for which we are both responsible. Finally, I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, looking not at her, but at the baby, "You destroyed my home, but perhaps you gave me a chance to build a new one." The words came out on their own. Maybe it sounded cruel, but I didn't want to decorate reality with false phrases. She shuddered, exhaled quietly, but remained silent. Because I understood, what was said was something that had been on the tip of my tongue for a long time, pain intertwined with quiet hope. Neither she nor I reached out to each other for a hug. We both realized that the wounds had not healed and trust had not yet been restored. There is no point in empty vows of eternal love if everyone has doubts and fears inside. We just sat next to each other for a while, listening to the newborn's steady breathing. In this silence, there was no warmth of family unity, but there was a tired honesty of people who decided to move forward without illusions. No fairy tale, no instant happy ending. Only two people who have to learn to live again every day for the sake of the children, for themselves, for the sake of the little boy in the cradle. I understood that there were many challenges ahead. We may never be able to regain our past feelings. Or, on the contrary, we will find a new path, starting from the fact that we have a common child. But right now, it is important not to create illusions. We are at the start, where there are no promises or big words. Only mutual willingness to try to live without lies, step by step. Outside the window, the starry San Jose sky seemed endless, but we both felt as if we were standing on a tiny piece of land, not knowing what would happen next. I looked at Emily. She froze, hugging herself with her arms as if afraid to cry. But no tears or reproaches followed. She made only one small gesture. She slightly moved the chair towards me, without touching me, but without shielding herself. We sat there for 10 minutes without saying a word. The baby slept with his mouth slightly open, peacefully moving his arms in his sleep. And in this stingy silence, there was more truth than in any stream of speeches. This is how our day ended, not with a fairy tale, but with an honest start to a path where there are no ready-made answers, but there is a chance for change. We are sitting next to each other, and a new person is breathing in the cradle, reminding us that the past is broken, but the future cannot be canceled. And subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.